Thanks for being here and demonstrating how tinsmithing works today. Jim Wagner, by the way. Just quick question. What you're going to produce right now is called what?
A coffin tray.
Coffin tray. So it does not need welding.
So the only tinsmiths don't weld; they solder joints.
Oh, okay. See, I didn't know that.
So it's all soft solder. And this one is not intended to hold a liquid, so you don't need to solder any of the joints closed. It's just a little serving tray or tray for collecting objects on the counter or something like that. They're called coffin trays because of the general shape. And then you had a question about soldering.
So if you have to solder, how is that done typically?
So there's the contemporary answer, which is a soldering iron, which I have set up over there. And then there's the historic answer, which is a small stove, charcoal or coal burning, and you put a soldering copper. And they're called coppers because the important end is made from copper because of its heat capacity and ability to conduct heat. You put it directly into the fire, into the embers, get it hot, and when you pull it out, you would have a stick of solder and you would touch it to that and melt the solder actually onto the soldering copper. So you can see where there's the solder on this. Then you take the object you wish to solder in the joint and you run the soldering copper along the joint, and that transfers the solder. Now you do use a flux at the same time, so you would apply the flux prior to putting that on. And the flux is something that basically helps protect the surface when it's gotten really hot so that you get a good joint. It also will melt and flow into the joint and pull the solder with it. So it's kind of a twofold practice. Historic fluxes, the one I use is pine rosin. Other things were called killed zinc. Issue is that it's corrosive, so you have to clean off the joints very well after you've soldered them. The advantage of pine rosin to me is that it's not corrosive, but it's kind of annoying to clean off. It leaves a brown residue that you have to scrape off and then wipe off with alcohol. So it's, you choose your poison. There were other things that were used. Fats were used, sometimes mixed with the pine rosin, sometimes just straight. But I think one of the most common one was pine rosin.
And tell me more about the solder.
So the traditional solder was ranged, it was a blend of lead and tin, and it ranged from about 40-60 tin to lead to 60-40 in reverse. So nominally 50-50 was what people will refer to it as a 50-50 solder. So that was the historic one. Today, because of concerns about lead, I use just pure tin. The difference is the melting point. The eutectic temperature of the alloy is much lower than pure tin. So you have to get things hotter. It's still not horribly hot. Tin melts at about 460 Fahrenheit, and so it's not horribly hot. Yeah, it's definitely a hot oven, but the historic blend melted more like 350. So it flowed a little easier. It didn't set up quite as fast, so it was a little easier to solder with. So the type of tinsmithing I do would have originated in colonial America on the seaboard, Atlantic states. Connecticut was one of the biggest tinsmithing states. And the methods I practice are, for the most part, the hand methods that would have been used in colonial America and before. That's to distinguish from the Hispanic culture, which does much more decorative types of things than what I do. The things I do are pretty much household type of items, the most decorative of which is the pierced tin barn lantern. Whereas a lot of the Hispanic culture do a lot of piercing and embossing of the tinware, and it's all very decorative. It's beautiful. So it's two very distinctly different kinds of schools of what gets done. So that's a Pennsylvania Dutch, a copy of a Pennsylvania Dutch barn lantern. The original that the piercing pattern is copied from is in Old Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts. They're barn lanterns in that while they don't give off a lot of light, when the door is closed and you're using it in the barn, if it gets knocked over in the hay, it will not start a fire because the candle's totally enclosed.
Thank you.
And barns, you know, you don't need a lot of light in a barn, as it tends to be a big open space. You're more worried about bumping into the stall walls or bouncing off the hay wagon than tripping over lots of things strewn across the floor. So it didn't need a lot of light, but also when it's pitch dark out, you don't need very much light to really improve what you can see. It's probably the most decorative piece, truly decorative piece, despite its utilitarian use. But that's also an advantage that people saw in tinware. Tinware was the cheapest metal cooking and serving vessels that you could buy, but it also looked nice and shiny. You didn't have to be rich to have something that looked nice in your house. So you can push the arm in and close it all up, and there's space in it. You could carry a couple extra candles. The 1900s and earlier, people used mirrors or reflectors to greatly increase the amount of light that was projected into the room. So it was commonplace to hang a mirror on your mantelpiece because that's where you would put a lot of candles. It was a space that you would set candles, and you could double the amount of light that went out into the room.
Another candle holder?
So that is the one item that has no historic precedent.
You just made it.
I just had fun making it, so it's just a little votive candle holder. So the second shelf is a teapot. The top shelf is a coffee pot.
Oh, okay.
And the folklore as to how you tell the difference has to do with the position of the spout. Because coffee grounds sink and tea leaves float. So if you have something at the bottom that you don't want to end up in your cup of coffee, you put the spout partway up the side. Whereas if you've got something at the top that you don't wish to end up in your teacup, you put the spout down close to the bottom.
I had no idea.
Such common sense.
It's folklore. I don't know how true it is, but that's the story. All the things there are just of the era, 18th, 19th century, or even earlier. Others are explicit copies of items that have been found at different sites. On the second shelf, there's a tall one and a squatter one. This squatter one is almost a porringer as opposed to a mug.
Yeah.
But those are similar to a set that was found at Fort Ligonier in Pennsylvania, which a fort the British built on their way to Pittsburgh to take it from the French in the French and Indian War. So they are a style that would have been around at that time.
Your question, does tin corrode?
We still cut over.
Yes, it does.
Or that would.
So it's actually tin plate. So the tin itself isn't what corrodes, it's the underlying sheet iron or sheet steel. And it was sheet iron up until about 1850 when it transitioned to sheet steel. Rolled out really thin. This is 28 gauge, which is roughly 15 thousandths of an inch thick, which is about a 64th of an inch. And it's a very common gauge that everything was made out of. An edge that wire will go into, like on the tray there. And I'm marking out where I want it to turn, and I'm using this little gauge to do that because holding a ruler on here is not very easy to do and get it accurate, whereas this simple little gauge, once you've made it, you can mark the edges easily. And then I have a number of stakes. Tinsmiths call their anvils stakes. And the folklore is that's because of the pointed end. And you can actually find pictures of tinsmiths just working on the ground with it driven into the ground or driven into a tree stump. And it's used to turn a straight edge. Most simple version of what today would be a sheet metal brake. It's rawhide.
Rawhide.
So tinsmiths work with either rawhide or wood mallets. I prefer rawhide ones, but I can use either one. I find the rawhide to be a little denser than most of the wooden mallets that I've come across. But they don't leave hard marks in the tin as you're working them. Whereas if I'm using a metal hammer, it would leave a hard mark. So this is known as a square pan swedge. It's basically a hammer on a hinge that will always hit in the same place. And it's got a straight edge that I can set the distance that I want it to go so that you can bend a straight line.